Now, I changed this a little bit, right? That here's the ontology, right? Here's the history, okay? And Foucault takes up a historical path, not an ontological, but doesn't talk about what things are, right? He talks about histories, right? So I'm going to present Foucault in a way that is not, well, it's a way that I have worked on him, right? It's a way I think that he moves, right? But I think it will help us to understand him because I'm going to introduce a concept that Foucault refers to a couple of times in his works, but in fact I think is central to understanding what he's doing, right? And that's the concept of a practice, right? Now I'm going to get to that in a minute, right? Foucault believes, right, with Nietzsche, that who we are is largely a product of a contingent history. He thinks that many of the things that are presented to us as natural or inevitable or the way we must be are in fact historical creations. Right, the one people might most know here is the idea of the normal. Right? So for Foucault, and I'll come back to the idea of the normal in a bit. Right? So for Foucault, right, he says, look, psychology has taught us, and this has changed some. Remember, he writes this in the 70s, right? He says that psychology seems to have a natural division of the normal and the abnormal. And the normal is this particular range here. As we'll see, it's a range nobody actually inhabits, right? Right? And which is going to be important for him, right? It's that normal is a certain range, and that there are other things distant from the normal in different ways and to different degrees, but they are who we are, right? So you have, right, the borderline personality at some distance from the normal in one direction, right? So let's say the schizophrenic at a greater distance, but in another direction, and that these are somehow natural categories, right? These are the ways we can classify humans as being, and you treat them once you find the right category into which they fall. Right? And my assumption here is that would not be a natural way of thinking about things for most anybody in this room, right? So, but right, I mean, you guys you work with the DSM, the DSM, like DSM, like this week is DSM-5, is it not, right? Or the other one, the ICD, right? Yeah, ICD-10, right? And DSM has a little catching up to do, right? So, and these are like natural categories, right? And what Foucault wants to ask is, how is it, A, that we came to these categories historically, and how is it, B, that we came to think they weren't historical, right? Right? What happened to make us think these were natural categories? So he tells these histories, right? Histories of the intersection of contingent practices that lead us to think certain things are natural, inevitable. He used the term anthropological constraints, right, the way things must be, rather than historical, contingent, changeable. Right? And he focused on specific concepts, specific histories. Right? Right. When Nietzsche does his genealogy, it is, I think might say, a bit fast and loose. He talks sweepingly about the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, and where it has led us. Right? Whereas Foucault, when he does histories, goes right on the ground, right, and does discussions of, right, everyday practices, how those everyday practices changed, and how they help create specific things. Right? So his histories tend to be less sweeping than Nietzsche's, more detailed, right? And I think as a result of that, more compelling. Right? Now, I've studied him philosophically. I've read some of the histories, historical treatments of him, and folks who take him seriously in history, right, we start in the continent and increasing here in the States, there are all debates about can we interpret history this way or that way, but he's always thought of as having said something important, right, even if there's disagreements on the nuances. Right? But then the question is, all right, how do you tell a history like that? How do you move from a sweeping history, Judeo-Christian tradition, this is what it looks like, to a history that's going to say, I'm going to use the term problematize, might turn into a problem, the concept, say, of the normal, which is what he does in Discipline and Punish. How do you do that, right? And the way he does it is through a history of the intersection of various practices that lead to a concept of the normal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I think, the concept of the practice, then I'm going to work with that history that Foucault works with around the normal. He works with different ones, but the one, and the normal is the one that I think would be most helpful for us, right? So first, practices, right? What's the practice? Foucault talked about saying, I do histories of practices, but he never said what a practice is, right? So, by the way, this is great because that leaves work for people like me to do, right? Right. So the idea of a practice, right? Is everyday and on the ground. The way I define the term practice, right, and I'll give you the full definition and then sort of prize it apart, right? Right. But I call a practice, right, a set of regularities of behavior. I'll just say it slowly because I'm going to parse it, right? Set of regularities of behavior, usually goal-directed, right? That is socially, normatively governed. Right? A set of regularities of behavior, usually goal-directed, that is socially, normatively governed. Okay.
And you're defining normatively.
I'm going to define all of it,
Okay.
right? Including the normatively, right? The regularities of behavior. You think of this. Think of baseball. Think child rearing, right? Think of different sports, right? Think of of therapeutic practice. There are regularities of behavior. Right? There are ways in which something's done to be this practice and not another practice, right? I say they're usually goal-directed because I can think of one exception, which is, and Walter will relate to this, is sitting Zen, right? Because if you've got the goal, you've missed the practice, right? And now people have said to me, well, yeah, but isn't the goal, right, okay, I understand, isn't the goal to not to have the goal anymore, fine. But and if people want to go like that, you can just cross out, usually goal-directed, right? But I want to taking things like Zen seriously. I want to say, no, we don't necessarily have to have. But most, look, the goal of baseball is to win. The goal of child rearing is to have, to develop with a kid the possibility of a meaningful life and things like that, right? Right, and of course to do all the things that you never did well, right? So there's different goals associated with different practices, but these things are on the ground. Now we got to get to the socially normatively governed, because that's where the interesting part is, right? That there are ways of going about practices. Some of them involve, maybe you use the term rules, but a lot of them are ways that one goes about the practice to be better or worse that aren't quite rules. Right? So for instance, right, when you teach a kid to ride a bike, which is it's a practice, right? When you teach a kid to ride a bike, you can't give them a list. Say, do all these things, and you'll be riding the bike, right? There's a certain feel, right? It's like the bike starts to turn, right? And they get the feel of how to twist your body, right? And there's no rule about this, right? But it is norm. There's a norm, and by norm I mean something really simple, right? Not normal, right? The normal is only one kind of norm, right? By the term norm, I simply mean better and worse ways of going about things, right? So there's all kinds of norms. But a norm is just better and worse ways of going about things. So learning to ride a bike, right, there are norms of how to hold your body, which can't be reduced to rules. In engaging in therapeutic practice, right, there are norms, right? Let's say that standing up and abusing the person who's come to you for conversation is probably not in any tradition, right? One of the norms one embraces.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure there's norms.
Gestalt.
Gestalt,
Yeah,
yeah, I was going to
There's
say.
always
Okay,
one.
fair enough. Actually,
Synanon.
What?
Synanon.
And I did Synanon type stuff with drug counseling, right? And there was this is a very short-lived, but when I was in psychology, there was a therapy called provocative therapy, Have you ever heard of provocative therapy? Right. The idea was to state the client's worst fear for them, so now it's out on the table, and right. But in any event, right, in general and for the most part, right, there isn't abuse of clients as one of the norms, right? So to get into the practice is to learn the norms of the practice, to learn what's going to make this practice go better and worse. Now, that's not to say that the norms themselves are not in dispute. Yeah, a lot of times the norms are, right? One of the things that narrative work has done is disputed, right, dominant norms in, right, say the practice of doing psychological work with folks, right? But in the name of other norms, right? These other, right, in the name of recognizing, for instance, that many of the problems that people come in ought not to be, and I'm using that word ought, there's your norm, right? Ought not to be ascribed to them in their inner psychological being, right? But ought instead to be recognized as coming from disempowering, right, narratives that they are taught, right, in their environment, right? The stuff that's that line of circles up there, right? And one of the norms of narrative practice,
where the shoulds come from.
yeah, is to I want to say also there is a should in narrative practice. We should recognize, right, these disempowering stories as not coming from inside the individual, but coming from the environment in which they're living, right?
Exactly, and this is a subtext, and that's why you're here, is to deconstruct and reimagine narrative practice.
Right.
Because we create our own contradictions.
Yes. I think that does happen in terms of there is this tendency, and I don't know how much is in our practice, but you see it elsewhere, to say we can't have any norms, right? And first, that's a norm, right? right? But second, if you look, you'll see the norms, right? It's when people say we can't have any norms, it's usually that people are hiding them from themselves. They're not seeing them, right? So there are norms associated with, there's no such thing as a practice without norms, right? Now, the norms, I said, are social, right? They're not just individual, right? They're around in the society or in the practice, which again doesn't mean they can't be challenged, okay? But there are ways of challenging norms and others, and they go in different ways, but I'm just going to give you an example because it's my favorite one, of challenging the norms. In this case, these norms were rules of a practice in favor of making the practice go better, right? And it comes from basketball. And I don't know how many of you know of the great basketball player Wilt Chamberlain, right? Right? Okay. Good, because when I talk to my students about it, like, Wilt who? Right?
Well, the stealth, man.
Yeah. Any case, when Chamberlain started to play basketball, he was so dominant. You have to understand how dominant this guy was. He was 7 feet. If he had chosen, instead of doing basketball, to be a runner, he would have been one of the best 400-meter runners in the U.S. He was that athletic, right? Because usually if you're 7 feet, you're not that as coordinated. He was ridiculously coordinated and, right, and huge and intimidating. And what happened was when he came into the league, people couldn't play basketball the same way anymore because he would swat everything away, the opposing team. Nobody could stop him on offense, right? And they created several rules, and they were called at the time Chamberlain rules, right? Because the idea was that with this guy in the league, we have to change our rules in order to make the game fair again, right? And there are 3 in particular that they changed, right? One is that about offensive goaltending. So if the ball is up by the rim, you can't touch the ball until it comes back off the rim, because the ball would get near the rim and he just grabbed the ball and put it in, right? Right. The second one was, you know how in basketball you have right. Here's the basket, right? You know what that looks like, right? And they call this thing here, right, the key, and they talk about shooting from the top of the key. It doesn't look like a key. It used to look like a key. Exactly, Meg. It used to be this, right? So it looked more like a key. What they did was they widened it, so they moved Chamberlain further from the basket, right? The idea was he's too close to the basket, nobody can stop him. So they pushed him out, right? So that's how the key became, that's the key. But my favorite is the last one, right? If you get fouled, you shoot foul shots, right? So you stand behind the line, you shoot foul, and your feet have to land behind the line, right? When you so you take a foul shot and you step like this, even if it goes in, it doesn't count, right? Now, that's a Chamberlain rule as well. Chamberlain could not shoot foul shots, just couldn't do it, right? So what he would do is he would run from the center of the court, step before the foul line, and dunk, right? He could go from the foul line to the basket and dunk, right?
And stay at the foul line?
No, that's the thing. He would cross the foul line and dunk the ball. So they figured, look, now we can't even foul the guy because he's just going to make his shots by running. And so the new rule was your feet have to land behind the line to keep him, right, honest, right, in foul shooting. So now think about why make these changes, right? You make the changes because the current norms of the practice are not really yielding a practice, right, that you're comfortable with anymore, right, because of the changes that are introduced by his athletic ability. So you develop norms, right? You modify the practice, right? And now you have a modified practice that responds to the goals of the practice, which is to have, a competitive sport in which people have a chance of winning. Okay. Now I'm just talking one practice, basketball, right? We've talked about practice of therapy. This practice of child rearing. So what I would argue, and what I would argue Foucault argues, right, is that who we are is largely a product of the practices we engage in. Right? And of course the way we engage in those practices. And to get that thought, think of it this way. Right? That let's suppose I were to ask you, right, tell me who you are, but don't tell me anything about any of the practices you engage in. Right? I want to tell me, like, abstract from your vocational practices, from your hobbies, from the practices you have in your relationships with your friends and your partner, right? All of anything that's socially normative to the government, abstract from all of that and tell me who you are, right?
I can't even give you my name.
Right? That's the idea. Who we are is largely a product of the practices we're engaged in, right? And of course the ways we take up those practices. So if that's the case, then what's going on in the practices is going to be really important for determining who we are. Because who are we? We are products of these practices. Right? So if one is asking the question of who one is, or Foucault, how we were made to be, one ought to look on the ground at the practices, right? The practices that form us, right? And the practice of which we're a part. Now sometimes, some of those practices we're mostly subject to rather than participants in. So when you're a kid, you're subject to child rearing practices, right? But you're not engaged in them, right? But that still helps make you who you are, right? So what Foucault is going to say, well, look, if we want to find out then who we are, then instead of asking what is our deep essence, right? That was the question he was rejecting, right? Let's ask, well, what's the history of the practices that formed us to be this way rather than another way? What's the history of the practices that made us think of ourselves in terms of the normal and the abnormal rather than some other way? But it's all tracing the practices on the ground. And there's this tendency, right, in philosophy, right, and elsewhere, right, to think that, to ask the question of who we are as looking for something deep and ahistorical. This is what it is, right, to be me or to be this human being. Right? What Foucault suggests is, no, let's look at the contingent history of the practices that formed us to be this way as opposed to some other way. Right? And Discipline and Punish, this is probably the most famous book, The History of Sexuality, all of his histories are to one extent or another ways of trying to ask the question, how did we become who we are? Or now I'm going to add one word, right? How did we become who we are now? Right? So the idea is, right, the way we are now isn't necessarily the way we were and isn't necessarily the way we have to be. So to me, the driving question in all of Foucault's work is, right, who are we now? And to answer the question of who we are now is to ask how we got there. And to ask how we got there is to ask what's the history of the practices that made us who we are now? Or to use the metaphor I used with John a minute ago, what are the history of the practices that deposited us on this particular shore and not some other one. Right? Now I want to stop for 1 minute because just, I'm going to move into a specific history Foucault talks about. Right? But before that, I want to make sure we feel clear with the background. Right? I know that in narrative practice the word scaffolding is used. Right? What I've just done here is theoretical scaffolding. Right? Right? Just give a set of concepts within which you can now move around and then understand what Foucault is up to. Right? But I want to make sure we feel clear. I mean, actually, two things. One, the idea of practice makes sense. Right? Also, I said a number of you have read about Foucault or heard something about Foucault, and I don't know how this is jibing with stuff you've heard. Right? So let me step back a minute and ask, what do we want to linger over at this moment? What feels unclear? What feels like it needs to come out more relative to what you understand about Foucault? Things like that.
Scott. So one, it's jiving really well.
Is it driving? Okay, okay.
Yeah, and two, the three questions you gave, which one you said, who we are now, how do we get there? What was the third one? The third one that
Okay.
backs up?
Oh, what are the practices?
Yeah, what are the practices?
Yeah, that led us here, right? And the idea of who we are now is that's to add the now is to insist, coming from Nietzsche and through Foucault, on the contingent character of it. Okay, that's what the now is supposed to do, right? The history is to say, okay, how do we discover it? And the practices is we discover it by looking on the ground at what we actually do.
What was the big book you mentioned? His major book.
Oh, Foucault's, the most famous one is called Discipline and Punish. And I'm going to actually give you a sort of some of the story of Discipline and Punish as an illustration of.
And history of sexuality is probably second.
Second, yeah. The first volume, History of Sexuality, is second, right? But when people talk about Foucault, discipline, like there's a Discipline and Punish, and then there's everything else, right? It really looms large in his work. Nancy.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You said the three things are who are we now, how do we get there, and what are our practices? Is that the three?
Yes, and each one leads backwards, right?
Because I would think how we got there would be the same as what are our practices.
Yes, that's right.
They're one and the same.
Right. What I'm saying is we ask who we are now, right, on the basis of how we got there. And we ask how we got there on the basis of the practices that led us there. Because if one did, let's suppose I did the second question, how do we get there, but not the third. One can say, well, look, the way we got here was some grand history that led us here, right? But Foucault saying, no, if you want to know how we got here, you look at the practices. So Nancy, that would be right.
So the first one is what are our practices? I don't know why you have to have the second two questions. How we got there and what are our practices?
Oh, well, what I'm saying is,
One and the same.
you cash one out, you cash the question who we are now in the question of how did we get here, and you cash that out in the question what's the history of those practices. It's taking and specifying exactly how the approach is going to be. That's all. Right? And it is in a sense, Nancy, there are versions of the same question. For
Right.
Foucault, there are versions of the same question. Now other people would approach it differently.
Is this personal agency?
Is that?
Would you say this is personal agency?
By personal agency you mean?
A person taking active initiative in their own way of choosing their life?
I would put it this way. If we understand things in this fashion, in the fashion Foucault does, then we can understand what are the norms to which we've been subject, right, by looking at the practices, right? What are the norms to which we are subject? And then, at that point, we're ready to take reflective.
So there's like two more questions really, intimated by practices. What practice led us here
Right.
is what discourses we've been affected by it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes. And I use the term practice, Hannah, and not the term discourse for a particular reason, right? It's a shift that actually Foucault made in his own work, right? In his early work, he talked about discourses, right? But later he talks about practices. The problem with just talking
You
about...
just used the word norms.
Yeah.
Yes, I changed it to discourses, but you just said what norms have we been subject to?
Oh, yeah, no. But you said also what norms in what discourses, right?
Norms.
Okay, okay, that's fine. Right. There is this tendency, right, to think of discourse as somehow disembodied language, right? And what he did in his early work, Foucault did that.
So that's synonymous, or the word practice actually sort of replaces the word discourse?
Yes, and incorporates it, right?
Okay.
So the idea is that practices aren't simply discursive. They aren't simply ways of talking, right? But the ways of talking are themselves embedded in our practices, right? And if ways of talking are embedded in our practices, right, then we have a richer conception of who we are, right? Who we are isn't a product simply of the ways in which we talk about ourselves, right? Who we are is a product of practices, and the ways in which we talk about ourselves are embedded in those practices, right? And you know this from your own work, right? If one approaches things, say, psychoanalytically, right, that's not just disembodied talk, right? That happens in, right, the actual physical movements of the therapist, right, which in traditional psychoanalysis are zero, right? And you move differently with Gestalt therapy, right? So the discourses are embodied or incorporated in the practices, right? They aren't just out there, right? The floating above and beyond. And Foucault gradually saw that, right?
That's a good idea. Yeah, because that's where that word sort of takes you a little bit.
Discourse.
Yes.
Yeah, it takes you into just language, right? Sam.
I'm just listening to this whole thing, and as I mentioned to you earlier, I go to incredibly Foucauldian college in the way that they approach things, and it's interesting starting because I've read History of Sexuality, but I haven't read my brain just discipline. Thank you. And it's another. I'm in the religious studies department over there.
So is he.
Okay. And one of my professors, instead of saying practice, says ritual. But I think that they're ultimately kind of one and the same.
Yeah, I prefer the term practice for this reason. It's more dynamic and changeable, right? Ritual also sounds as though it's very rote and closed, right? But practices don't have to be rote and closed. Some are, right? And others are not, right? So there can be, I would put it this way, there can be ritualized practices, right? And then there can be other practices which are not ritualized. But for Foucault, what's important is not the ritual, but the practice, right? Yeah, that would be fair. Good. So, no, conceptually, how comfortable are we at this point? Good. We're okay? Okay.
So
How would we know?
We would have a discourse.
or practice.
Actually, you know what would happen is you start asking questions. I'm thinking, what the hell are they thinking, right? So actually, the way I often tell if people are on board is on the questions, right? If the question's like, yeah, that's the kind of question I would expect someone to ask, right? But and then other times it's you realize no, we're not in the same space. Just before we go, I just tell you just a story. I had I was teaching philosophy and I had a student, and I was trying to get across. This is not stuff we're going to worry about here, but the difference between what's called instrumental value and intrinsic value. Instrumental value is something's good just because it gets you something else. It's purely an instrument, right? And intrinsic value, it's good all by itself. And I say, I hold the chalk up, and I say the chalk has no intrinsic value, right? It simply has instrumental value. It allows me to do things I need to do. And I said, the reason I can tell you this is I take the chalk and I actually throw it against the. I said, nobody's going to say to me, I can't believe you just did that to the chalk, right? Because the chalk doesn't have any value except as an instrument, right? It has no intrinsic value on its own, okay? Student raises his hand and says, right, why is it that we can't believe you threw the chalk? We just saw you do it. And
Why can't we what?
why could, right? I used the I can't believe you used the chalk. That was my, right? Which is like, let's like, why did you do this thing to the chalk, right? And he took it literally, right? And at that moment, Hannah, I know it's time to step back, right, and do some more work, right? That's what I mean. The questions sometimes tell you, right, whether the person's on target or, right? And I should just because we've been at hard concepts to continue with the story with this guy, right? He shows up in my office later to drop the course, right? A good idea. But what he does is, in showing up to drop the course, his class did terribly on their first exam, right? They wound up doing fine, but they did terribly on the first exam. Like 80% got D's and F's. And he said, well, I'm dropping the course. He said, well, the thing was, he says, that like 80% of us got D's and F's, so we must have known the material. And I'm thinking, how? How does it get here, right? What's that move from 80% got D's and F's to, and then I was thinking, wait a minute. I said, what you're saying to me is this: 80% of us got D's and F's. Therefore, the problem was not us. The problem was the exam was too hard. Therefore, if you'd given us an easier exam, we'd have done better. Therefore, we knew the material. He says, yeah. That's like it was like, oh yeah, it's obvious. Yes, of course. That's what it is, right? And I looked at him and I said, I know you're dropping, but I got to tell you, I'm going to miss you.
Did he become a bartender at Cheers?
So, in any event, are we okay with the scaffold? Okay, I'm sorry, Walter, I put you off.
No. So for the neurophiles here, or the neuralistas, there's a lot of shifts going on. One, moving from discourse to practice.
Right.
Because we have discophilia. Sweet.
Discoursephilia or discophilia? Those are very different.
I'm staying alive. Work with me. I'm staying alive. Discourse fever. The realities of shared discourse. And moving it to practice, and Foucault was defined as a historian of systems of thought, and now you're moving it to systems of practice.
Absolutely.
Bless you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there is a tendency sometimes to see Foucault as simply on about discourse, which he was in his earlier works. But the ones that are influential, the ones that were influential on Michael White and narrative are not the earlier ones, right? They're the later ones. Discipline and Punish, History of Sexuality, things like that. And those are the ones where Foucault is quite clear that what he's talking about, right, is not just discourses, right? He's talking about ways of building buildings, right? Ways in which gender is different kinds of movements of people's bodies and things like that. And when I give the example from Discipline and Punish, that'll all become clear. They're practices. They're not just discourses, right? Although I know this term discourse has stuck in many places. I just think it's not an accurate rendering of what Foucault's on about. Right?
I shall never use it again.
Right. Well, if you do, you call it disco, that's all. Right. Good. Other questions or thoughts about this, the theoretical scaffolding? Right. So, okay, we'll move into the story, right? So we have to illustrate this, right? We have, right, a conception. What is it going to look like as we see this on the ground? So what I'm going to give you is sort of a quick version of Discipline and Punish where he traces this history. Right? And in Discipline and Punish, he's tracing fundamental changes in the history of punishment that will lead us toward normalization. That's going to, the end of the story is going to be, we think of the normal as a natural category, but it comes from this particular history, and that's the history I'm going to start to tell. But again, only sort of quickly, right? In the book's 300 pages. So, so he said it used to be, right, back, particularly say up to the 1500s, right, that punishment was done in a very simple manner. Either you did what was permitted, and then you were left alone, or you did what was forbidden, and then you were punished mercilessly, right? So you have this picture here. Let's see. Of the permitted and the forbidden, okay? This space, nothing happens to you, completely ignored. This space, very bad things happen to you. Right? Now, often one of the problems with this is that the kinds of punishments that people underwent tended to be long, right, vicious, and required lots of resources. Foucault, Discipline and Punish opens with a 5-page description of the torture of somebody who attempted to kill the king. And it's actually I read the book 3 times before I could actually get from one end of that to the other. It's really rough reading, right? But in any event, right, it takes a lot of resources. Now, what happens is that historically, right, there are people who are against this, this barbaric torture on the one hand. At the same time, there's a development in society toward a sort of a nascent capitalism. Right? And in this nascent capitalism, the issue of protecting property becomes more important than it had been. So you need to develop a form of punishment which will protect property crimes, which can be much more rampant than a lot of the earlier violent crimes. So you need to be able to punish more efficiently, right, to stop people from committing property crimes. And at the same time, right, less barbarically, because these are property crimes now, these aren't crimes of violence. And so you have this convergence of, right, on the one hand, punishment reformers, we might call them, saying this is too barbaric, and on the other hand, the rise of the beginnings of a different economic system, right? And they're putting pressure on punishment, right? Now the kinds of punishment that occurred don't seem to be as the kind of punishments that occurred don't seem to be reflecting the particular social needs. And what happens is you have a convergence of a series of other practices in a particular place, which is the prison. Now remember, I mean, for us, if we think of anything as natural, and I say there's this tendency to think of prison as natural. If somebody does something really wrong, you put them in prison, right? But if you stop to reflect on it, you might want to say, why, right? Why prison, right? Why did that develop as opposed to some other kind of thing that we might be doing, right? We didn't always have prisons, right? And as Foucault says, asked the question, how did the prison become the answer for every criminal problem, right? And so he traces this history in which he says, look, well, what happens is this, right? Some people are removed from society, right? These are people who say have been stealing, right? But they're not just locked up, because there's a series of other things that converge to create, right, the particular thing that is the prison. So, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of them, right? One, there is a particular strict scheduling, right? Everything happens this time and at this time, at this time, right? And again, it comes to seem natural in the prison, right, that things are regimented by time, but it didn't used to be that way. It used to be a lot less regimented. Where did that come from? Well, it was borrowed from the monasteries, right? In the monasteries, there's always the schedule. You get up at 4 o'clock, you pray to this time. And so in the prison, the scheduling was borrowed from the monasteries. That's on the one hand, right? Then, right, you have another set of practices developed, of all places, in the Prussian military, right? Because in the Prussian military, what military strategists there discovered was that the difference between killing somebody and getting killed, right, even with these crude weapons, was a matter of a few seconds. So what you need to do was make your people, your soldiers, as efficient as possible in handling their weapons. So whereas before, right, people just handled weapons however they handled them, right, the Prussian army developed a strategic regimen and how to handle a gun most efficiently. They broke the human body down into parts, right, and actions and sub-actions, right, and tried to make the most efficient way to get the gun, load the gun, raise the gun to the shoulder, so you can do it as, and drill it so you're just a little bit faster than the guy who's shooting at you, right? So they do that by breaking down body parts, not breaking, but breaking down motions, right? Breaking down body motions. Sorry. Not well said. You break down motions, find out the most efficient motion, and then build back up to the most efficient way to grab the gun, load the gun, right, aim it, and shoot it. Right. Now, what happens in what happens in the prisons? Right. What we come to call rehabilitation, right, is often been mechanized work. Right. Same as in the factories. Right. Here's the most efficient way to go about doing your job. And that gets imported into the prisons, right? Another thing that happens is there are various kinds of observation that are arising now, not in the monasteries and not in the military, right, but in health and psychological work. Observing people, drawing conclusions from the observation of behavior. So what gets created, that's called the prison, right, is a convergence of different sets of practices that yield something in particular. Right? What they yield is this. Right? You have a prisoner. You're going now to make the prisoner more efficient than they were before. And in making them more efficient, you're going to see how far are they from the norm, right? The most optimal way of acting. How far are they from that, and what can we do to get them there? Right? How do we train them, discipline them? Right? And he says, look, it happens in various ways. Right? It happens through various forms of observing them. Right? It happens in breaking down their bodily motions, right, and make them more efficient. Right? All of these forms of rehabilitation come not from some grand scheme, right, but rather from a set of contingent practices from the monastery, right, from health observation, right, from the military, that come together in the prison. And coming together in the prison, they begin to create a way of looking at prisoners that now is going to filter back out into society. Right? What's that way of looking at prisoners? Well, look, there's the most efficient person. There's the one who can do things right, the best. That's the norm. Right? Now, that's the norm that is the normal. Everything else is abnormal in one way or another and removed from it. So the picture that emerges in the prison is not this. Right? That's the old picture. Right? The picture of punishment is more like this. You have the most efficient point here, right? And then you have the development of the knowledge of people who are in one way or another, right, and to one extent or another, right, distant from the normal. Right? Why is it that they cannot be here? Well, maybe, right, as I mentioned before, maybe they have some obsession compulsion. Right? So they're maybe, say, over here. Right? Right? Or maybe, right, they have deeper problems. Right? They're schizophrenic. Right? So they're sort of further out here. Right? Right? Or they have some other deeper problem. But all of these are ways of finding out how a person is not normal, and in order to be able to make them more normal. Now, if you compare this with this, Foucault's not saying this is bad, this is good. Right? Right? He's not in favor of the kinds of tortures that were permitted. But there's an important change that happens. And this is the change, right, that you'll recognize. Yeah. Which is that in this space, if you were up here in the permitted, you were never intervened on. Right? Nobody cared. You were left alone. You create a space that looks like this, and almost everybody can be intervened on, because there's almost nobody who finds themselves really efficient. And you know this, right, from the phrase, everybody could use some therapy. Right? Why could everybody use some therapy? Well, on the traditional story, everybody could use some therapy because nobody's really normal. Right? Right? And that comes from this picture. Right? And that picture, right, is the product of a set of contingent practices, right, that converged in the prison, right, and then ramified out, right, in such a way that this then becomes, we think of this as normal and natural. I think the idea everybody could use some therapy is normal, natural. Everybody's a little bit ill-adjusted, normal and natural, right? So we think of things in that way, but that is a historical product, right? But a historical product that justifies, in advance, intervening on almost anybody, right? And now what do you have? The proliferation of personnel departments, right? From the alcohol divisions to social services, right? To the psychiatric services. All of these proliferate, but they proliferate because, right, of a view that we have of what it is that is normal, that is natural, which is a certain normality from which people are distant one way or the other. So what is the product of that history I just recounted appears to us as natural, right, and inevitable, and we just we go with that without realizing that we have been produced to be this way, and we can be otherwise than the way we've been produced. Was it?
Otherwise produced.
Or, right, if we're going to, that's it. If we go to agency, if we see this as not inevitable, then
So did he say this process was either valuable or not valuable?
the process.
This process you described, did Foucault say not valuable?
What he said, right, and this comes back to what Jim asked about valuations, right? You might ask, okay, let's compare this and this, right? Right. He saw this process as involving a series of problems, which we need to recognize, right? So, for instance, right, this way of being here allows all kinds of oversight, supervision, observation that is constraining on people. Right? It also plays in, right, to, we could say, making a more efficient capitalist system, of which he had critiques, right? But here's where we have to be really careful. Foucault said, look, all of this stuff, right, has problems. That didn't mean he wants to go back to this, right? His view was, here's where we are. Here are some of the problems associated with it. But then, not to say, here's what you do next. He was always reticent to say that, because he said, look, it's not my job to tell you what you ought to do next. Let me tell you, here's a history of how you got here, right? That isn't the way you're thinking about it, right? Because it's historical, involves all kinds of power relationships, et cetera, right? Now, what you want to do with that is up to you, right? Now, why did he do that? Because he was worried about the role of the intellectual, being the one who says, follow me, right? I will lead, you follow, right? He said, look, his role as an intellectual was not to tell you how to liberate yourself, to tell you whether you wanted to liberate yourself, to tell you what liberation was, right? His role is to show us what he called the problematic character of our present, in order that we can now reflect and ask ourselves, what do we want here? What do we not want here? Without him, as an intellectual, prescribing from on high what it ought to look like.
So this is a shift of the role of intellectualism as well.
It is. And his reaction is against the French philosopher Sartre. Okay? So the French philosopher Sartre, writing in the 40s and 50s, was a grand intellectual in the sense that, that Foucault was worried about. Right? A grand intellectual in the sense that what Sartre did was he said, you know, here's how we are, here's where we should go. Right? For Foucault, the role of the intellectual had to be more modest than that. Right? Foucault often said, right, it's up to the people. It's up to people to emancipate themselves, not for me to tell them how to do it. Right? What I can provide, right, are certain intellectual tools. Right? Spend my life, as he did in historical archives. I can show you, right, two things. Right? One, I can show you that things that you took as natural, inescapable, inevitable, are in fact historically contingent. One, and two, very much related, I can tell you how they got to be that way. Right? And in telling you how they got to be that way, now we're beginning to answer the question, right? Who are we now? But now be really careful here, right? This is only one angle of who we are now, right? Because who we are now isn't simply a product of the normal and normalization, right? But this is one story, right? There are other stories to be told, and he tells other ones in other texts, right? Why? Because who we are now it's complicated, right? Right? And if you're telling a story from on the ground rather than up high, you can expect that any given story is going to be only part of this, right? Part of the story of who we are. Right? So this is one important element in that story of who we are now. We came to be this way. We came to think of normalization as important and as natural because of a history of practices that in their contingent intersection led us here and not somewhere else. I want to stop and see that. Good, Sam.
I just want to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where he kind of gets the idea of make die, let live, and let live make, or wait, make die, let live, make live, let die.
Yeah, that's another shift that comes in the history of sexuality,
okay.
right? Where he's talking there, one of the things he also talks about is not how you individualize people,
Yeah.
right, but how you deal with populations, which becomes a concern of his in some of his later lectures.
Okay.
Right, right. But notice what happens here, right? That it's as though each of us gets individualized in a particular way, right? So that if a person, in, say in the prison, commits a crime, right, it's not that they have committed a crime, it's not the act, but the crime rather becomes the expression of who they are, right? If we want to know what you want to know about your crime, we don't look at what you did, we look at who you are, and then your crime becomes an expression of that. That's why diagnosis is so important, right? So, as he said, that what Foucault says in Discipline and Punish, that the crime becomes smeared across their history, right? Right. Their history is the kind of history that would have led them to this kind of crime, right? But what we do is we trace backwards. Here's the crime. Who must they be in order to have committed that crime, right? And now you've got the setup for your whole DSM. Good. Now I'll stop from here. Other questions or thoughts just about this? And again, intersections with stuff you've heard about Foucault, read about Foucault, things like that. Meg.
What's the difference? I mean, he sounds like an historian. I mean,
He is, in a way, right? He called himself a genealogist from Nietzsche. Nietzsche said what he did was genealogies. He borrows the term from Nietzsche, right? He distinguishes it from history in a particular way. He's got a particular view. When he's saying I'm doing genealogy, not history, he has a particular view of what he means by history, right? I mean, in some pedestrian sense, of course he does history. Right? But the history as it is often traditionally done, and I think it was true in France, probably less so in the United States, but still so here, that it's the march of progress, right? That we tell a grand story of how it is that we now are better than where we were, and usually not by events on the ground, right? And like U.S. history is the big arc, the big grand story, right? And he says, I'm not doing that.
when I think of history and historians, and people who are studying and writing, often it really becomes an exposition of that contingency that so often things happen and then somebody later on says, okay, this is why it happened.
Right.
And it's, in other words, most history is written sort of backwards.
Right.
Yes, and in that sense, it can be, but now there's still distinctions here, right? Because for Foucault, he wants to know a history of who we are now, right? So those are the elements that are going to concern him, right? The practices that intersected in a historically contingent way to make us who we are now, right? That's what he's interested in, right? The other thing is that many historians, I know this in the U.S., right, are not, if they're not interested in the grand thing, it's because they're interested in some detail to make their career, right? So, historians, I know, will criticize Foucault, saying, but it's too big a story he was telling. Like by which they mean he drew a moral from it, right? Right? It had a point, right? Right? Rather than simply saying, okay, this happened, oh, by the way, here's the causal connections that led here, right? So he wants to talk about the causal connections that lead us to being who we are now, right? Jenna, you got a thought?
Well, in terms, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how he was saying, okay, I'm showing you here kind of how these practices intersected historically so that you can now decide for yourself if what kind of liberation or emanciation you need from that. It was really my understanding from reading White's version of Foucault that that narrative, for example, isn't about liberation, that we don't have to liberate. And I'm going back to my thoughts earlier of that grand cultural narrative is something that we just work with. So we need to, it's like taking that circle, instead of it being a normative circle, it's now a knowledge of what's inside that circle with us and how we want to navigate with that versus a liberation from it, because we can't get rid of all that stuff.
Good. Let me say two things, Jana. I mean,
We can work with it and navigate it. So excuse me.
yes, but it's going to be more than navigating, than just navigating, because you can navigate without changing or challenging anything in here, right? So it's exactly right to say we're not going to just shed the history, right? The history is going to be there, right? But that doesn't mean we have to ratify it in the way that it has impacted us, right? So in not ratifying it in the way that it has impacted us, right, we offer ourselves, right, other routes. And when I use the term liberation or emancipation, right, that's what I mean, right?
Okay, thank you.
But the other element of it, and that you also cotton on to, and that's been floating around here a lot, is that when Foucault says, look, it's not up to me to tell you where you want to go, right? Isn't that a lot like the narrative work that says, look, I'm not going to tell you how you cure yourself, right? I'm going to use the term open a space, right? Right, that we can open space in which people can reflect and ask themselves the question, based on different ways of viewing their history, of who they would like to be, right? How they would like to carry themselves forward. So I think the reticence that Foucault had in prescribing at the end of his histories was, I think, very much the reticence that you see in narrative practice for wanting to prescribe for folks, for right, that tendency to move away from what is often the prescriptive psychological project. Here's what's wrong with you. Here's how you get better. Right. So I actually think you see that. If we go back downstream again, right? I think you see that reticence in the practice itself. Right? Jim.
I'll use the term accommodate as opposed to remediate.
Say more.
What's that?
Say more.
Okay, you accommodate where you are on the ground. You don't try to remediate or change everything that's come before.
Yes, you don't. I'm going to press on this a little bit harder, right? You don't remediate, surely in the sense that you can't change what happened before because it's already happened, right? But the question is, if we're going to talk about navigation, there can be various ways in which people might take it up. Right? So, for instance, right,
That would be the accommodation.
Right. And I'm going to take that word accommodation. I'm going to try to offer several possibilities, right? Because the word accommodation could mean I'm just going to live with it. It's no good. I'm going to live with it, right? But and by the way, that's an option. Like if you have a conversational partner, and they say, yeah, I see this story. I see how I was formed. I see the practice I engage in. Right. I see. Let's say I see myself as a victim all the time, and I'm cool with that, right? Right. Then your job isn't to say, no, you shouldn't be cool with it, right? So the combination in that traditional sense can be one. Right. There can be others as well. There can be challenge, right? One can say, look, right, I'm going to challenge some of these categories in which, right, I was brought up, either in which I was therapized, right, or educated, or whatever, right? It can be challenged, right? It can also be alternative. What are some alternative practices I might develop? Practices that exist that are alternatives to the ones I've engaged in. Ways of taking practices that I'm engaged in and seeking, right, normative change within them, new ways of going about and thinking about these things, right? All of this field is wide open, right? So the term, Jim, the term you're using for accommodation, right, and the term that I've used, sort of liberation or emancipation, right, is simply to indicate, right? We'll come back to Hannah, the word personal agency, right? You start asking yourself, now that you have a sense of the contingent history by which you have arrived, what does this mean for you? What do you want to do with this? Where do you want to take this? Do you want to take this anywhere in particular? Right? So all of this becomes open. Right? If we had a preconceived idea of what was normal, right, and not normal, we would know, okay, well, if you're over here, right, here's what we got to do to get you at least closer to here. Right? But in narrative work, if that isn't predetermined, then, right, that's the point at which you become, I say, the Foucaultian, right? The one who says, okay, look, I can give you these tools, but there are questions ultimately that you're going to be asking yourself that we can converse about. But I'm not going to tell you, I cannot tell you who you ought to be. Mark?
So he was the decentered but influential philosopher.
Decentered in what sense, Mark?
That he wasn't saying that these are the only and best ideas, to saying I'm offering, these are my ideas, what are your ideas, and trying to influence people to think, whereas decentered and influential narrative therapists explore people's lives and meanings, but they're not the ones, the therapist is not directing, this is what you need to do.
Yes. Good. I want to stay with that up to a point, and at the point where, again, there can sometimes be confusion, right? When Foucault says, these are my ideas, right, he's not saying, look, this history that I just told you could be told in another way in which these things would not come out contingent. Right? He's committed to that. He's committed to this being the right history. Right? In other words, he's committed to the idea that the normal, right? Now remember, we're distinguishing norms from normals, all kinds of norms. Right? He's committed to the idea that the normal is a historical product of these particular practices. And if you, and he's not, and if you say to him, well, isn't that just one view of the normal, right? He would have to say, no, I just told you, right? Now, you might say to him, or better, how might one challenge him? Well, when one challenges him is by going and seeing, is there a problem with the history that he's told, right? But none of this is just in my opinion, right? That's where this idea is. Sometimes people, well, I have my truth, you have your truth, and that gets way overplayed in my view, right? That Foucault's view is, right, that normalization is a product of a contingent history. And if you're going to argue with him, you'd have to show, right, something different, right? And it comes out in the first volume of History of Sexuality. Because people say, well, for Foucault, he was just making up stories. And that's just not true, right? He says in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, he's put some ideas on the table. He says, further historical research may yield that I'm wrong about this, right? So he was committed to an idea of truth, right? But what he wanted to do was stop at a certain point, at the point at which now you have a story about at least one dimension about how you were formed to be the person you are, right? Stop there, right? And then say, I can't prescribe for you, right? And that was a movement very much against the tenor of French intellectual life, right? Which was, I'm the intellectual, let me tell you how it goes, right? Right. So, and in one sense, he's resisting that tendency at two levels, right? He's not telling people who they ought to be, on the one hand, but he's also, right, not telling the one single story about who we are. He's telling one story. Then he has another genealogy. And he says, other people do, his students would do different genealogies, right? Describing different aspects of who we are now, how we got to be this way. So he's modest at two levels, right? One, in not prescribing, and also in not trying to tell the grand story, right, that all of us will now fit into, right? But rather a contingent story from practices on the ground, right, that all of us find our way into, are subject to one way or another, and to a greater or lesser extent. Right?
It sounds like this modesty is very important to you. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell me more about the modesty being so important?
Yes. The idea is this, that there is, and it comes from me as a philosopher, right, that there is a philosophical tendency, right, to pronounce on everything, right? And in reading and thinking about Foucault, right, I mean, and this is where now you asked about where I come from. It's much more within this, right? I've come to think, no, a lot of, maybe put another way, right, that philosophy cannot dictate, right, in the grand way, who we are. It can tell us relevant things, right, but it can't dictate who we are. So what we have to do is follow the stories, right, and often follow stuff that's closer to the ground, rather than, right, in a large and grand story.
What have you found that the modesty has invited or made possible?
For me, right, and I think, and probably for Foucault as well, I would say a more accurate way of seeing who I am and where and where I fit. So, for instance, right, this right? This story I just told you, this is what got me thrown out of psych grad school, right? Because, right, what?
Wow. What?
Yeah, yeah. I was in psychology grad school for 2 years, and the second year I was reading Foucault, and I started to raise questions, and I said, wait a minute. What the shift for me was, I was thinking about how to do psychology better. Foucault raises this question: really, should you be doing psychology at all, right? And so that shift for me, right, raised the question which I hadn't thought about, but it raised it because he looked at the development of psychology in a way, right, that led me to start questioning my own participation in it. Right? Now, many people here, right, at some point question participation in it, I'm sure, right? But rather than going out of psychology, this is where the intersection with narrative came. This is another way of doing psychology, right? Whereas for me, it led me out, right, and into Foucault and philosophy. And as I mentioned before, you know, I went to philosophy, just never came back out, right? It was just too interesting for me.
So, what I wrote down here is normal was the product of our contingency history.
A contingent history, yes.
Okay. So, does he only talk about the grand contingent history as normal? I mean, I can have my own normal for my contingent history, and then you can have a societal normal or a governmental normal or a family normal. What's he referring to?
He's referring to societal normal, and particularly normal as it would be implicitly or explicitly endorsed by, we might say, the various practices of psychology, what he calls the psycho-practices, right? So, for instance, right, whatever the more or less convergence would be between academic psychologists, practicing therapists, social workers, right? The view of normal that floats around there, and that to one extent or another, right, becomes important for how people think about themselves, right? So you think, I mean, when you're a kid, what do? You get if you're a little bit out of line, you get sent to the school counselor or psychologist. Right away, you're there. By the way, I should mention that you know, in my own case, right, that the schools wanted me on Ritalin, right, when I was young, right? They thought I was hyper. I don't know where they got this idea, but they thought I was hyper. They wanted me on Ritalin. My mother, to her great credit, refused this, right? But I mean, right away, it was this guy's doing things that are not normal, right? So where do you go? You go to the counselor, right? And then from the counselor, right, the school counselor, you go to the personnel. You know, get a job, you go to the personnel. So all of this, there's a sort of a tracing of normality through all of this stuff. That's the normal that Foucault's talking about, right? Right there. Later in his career, he talks about other forms of normal, like what's statistically the norm, which is not the same thing as this, right? In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite, because here, the normal is something almost nobody achieves. The statistical normal is the one that most people are achieving. So we got to be really clear on laying out our that term norm and the term normal are really tricky. Well, can I do one thing? Right, Sherry hasn't had a chance to ask a question. I know I have others. Will we come right back? Can I let Sherry in before we? Yeah.
I just had a thought about how an example of how I see this is how we have like different, like you have your island of normal and your sea of pathology.
Right. Nicely put.
Thank you. And I realized that one way in which we see conflict of this is when we have different norms, that like different cultural norms,
Mm-hmm.
like for example, different cultural norms about family. Like the African American family is a different norm versus like, you know, the dominant white culture of family. And so when you have a dominant white cultural provider looking at an African American family and the way they do things, you're going to pathologize that if you don't understand their norms.
Absolutely.
If you're going by your own norms.
Yes.
And that just hit me as we were talking.
No, I think that's exactly right. And let me put it this way, right? These norms here, right, were not developed by African American Latino populations, right? Right? They tend to be developed by people who look a lot like the people in this room, right? Right. Yes.
I was just going to say, I was doing some training in the DSM-5, and part of the history was being given. And one of the things he was talking about was, you know, the process they used to get things in there. And so they did this little piece of research, maybe people have heard of it, where they put normal people into state hospitals. And they had them do certain behaviors to get in there. And then when they got in there...
This is the Rosenthal study?
Yes. Was it the
Yes.
Rosenthal?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, it just came to mind as you were,
Yeah, the Rosenthal study. No, Foucault would have, I don't
And
think
then
he.
say the end of it. Say the-
Yeah.
well, and so then the people went in and acted normal, because they weren't really what they prescribed themselves to be when they went in. And yet the people in the hospital continued to treat them as schizophrenics and bipolars, and they looked for those behaviors and said, yes, indeed. It's kind of like the ADHD thing and the bipolar thing today,
Right.
is we've got that on high alert, and so many people, I think, are misdiagnosed because they're popular today.
There's a part of that story, I don't know if this
Yeah.
is true or not, but that the only people who really suspected that those plants were not supposed to be there were the patients.
Right, that's right, yeah, yeah.
So let me do this. It's 12:20. What we're gonna break for an hour for lunch. Is that it? And then when we come back, let's do the groups, right? So people can talk. We'll come back. Right? We'll talk more about Foucault based on the questions you have, and then we'll do some Deleuze. As I mentioned to Sam, Deleuze is rough. It's going to be a little rough. Just trust me on Deleuze. We'll get through it. It's going to sound really weird at the beginning. I think we'll get through it, but you're going to have to trust me a little bit. There are moments in Deleuze that are just difficult, right? And there's no way around it. But right, as we say in New York, trust me. In jumping in there, let me start with a question that Jana raised at break, right? And say something, because she was still thinking about this idea of liberation, emancipation, particularly with the stuff that Michael White had said. And so I wanted to say a little bit more about that. Right? Foucault did resist the term liberation and the term emancipation. Right? In doing that, he was resisting a particular thing. The idea of emancipation or liberation is that there's something there to be liberated, which is being suppressed, repressed by the power structures. Right? And the idea was to release this thing which is being suppressed. So the idea that he was fighting against was the idea that there is a something, an essence, an identity already there, waiting to come out. And you see this in a number of different political movements. So for instance, 19th century anarchism, right? Many 19th century anarchists thought that humans were essentially benign, essentially good, and that if you could just eliminate the power relationships, that goodness would come out, right? That's the liberation, right? In a sense, Marx has this as well. He has a notion of what he calls species being, what it is to be human, and it's being denied, exploited by capitalist power relationships. And if you eliminate those, it will come out, right? And what Foucault was resisting, and I think what White was picking up on, is that idea of liberation or emancipation. So when Foucault says, "I'm not going to prescribe," what Jan was asking, so what's supposed to be emancipatory about that? And my claim is it's not that now you get to see what's the real thing inside of you that can come out and see expression. But rather, you're in a space in which you can decide how it is you want to move from there. Emancipation in that sense, right? That you've been, we can put it this way, that you've been gripped by a story and a way of seeing yourself. And by seeing that story and way of seeing yourself as historically contingent, right, the grip gets loosened. And the emancipation is the loosening of the grip and the allowance to move in other directions, not the release of something that's there, suppressed, waiting to come out. Right? That idea of something there, suppressed, waiting to come out, that would be an essentialist view. Right? And that's what Foucault wants to avoid. Now, does that make sense? And in that sense, when Michael White says he's not for emancipation and liberation, that's the thing he's not for, right? Because obviously, he's not saying, well, I want these stories to have no effect whatsoever. They would just turn out to be neat stories, right? But rather that we're not looking for the thing that the therapist knows is there and has to figure out in order to release it, right? But it's still emancipatory in another sense.
And then, But he would say if that what you'd be liberated to find would be some other happier story for yourself. Because I would assume that he's sort of saying you can't really define how we are outside of stories.
Right.
Or outside of practices.
Yes. Yes, right.
There isn't any.
No, right, you're not going to move. There's two things you're not going to do. You're not going to move from practices to something that isn't practices, right? Right, because what would that look like, right? I mean, acting without sort of any norms or social regularities. It'd just be random behavior, right? So it's not that. But the other thing, and this is something that Jana was insisting on earlier when we were talking, is you're not going to remove yourself from your historical context either, right? You may challenge it, but you're going to challenge it from within that context. So that all of that is circumscribed, right? And in thinking about its meaning and its place, right? One thinks in narrative ways, right? But that thinking, there are certain narratives which lose their grip. And you can think of it now, right, back with Foucault. If for Foucault, once this story about normalization emerges as historically contingent, as changeable, as problematic, right, that the idea of normalization begins to lose its grip. Right? Now we don't have to think this way and see ourselves this way and act in accordance with this anymore. Right? That isn't telling us what we ought to do. Right? It's just telling us, right, it's loosening the grip of something that we have had before. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is that what you mean by emancipatory in another sense?
Yeah, emancipatory in that sense, right? In that sense of the loosening of the grip of something, right? That seemed to, with Foucault, there would be things which seem natural, inescapable, inevitable, normalization, et cetera, right? In therapy, it could be a particular story, right, that seems to have a grip on person, that if you can begin to see how that grip came, and also, right, what other stories might be told, then that story looks less inevitable, right, and more contingent and changeable.
I think you've largely answered this already, but I keep getting hung up on this idea that he's not for liberation, emancipation in the traditional sense, because I mostly know Foucault's name through contemporary feminist writings and thinking, genderqueer communities, and these very groups that would use the term liberation for a lot of what they're trying to achieve.
Right.
And they're always calling on Foucault.
Yes, and liberation, the term liberation and emancipation are just, they're fraught, right? They have different meanings. And let's say a feminist reading Foucault, right, is likely not to read Foucault as allowing them to emancipate their feminine side, which has been suppressed, right? But rather, right, emancipation in the sense of being able to create alternatives. Right? We might put it this way, right, that for Foucault and for for Foucault and for Deleuze, right, that the end point of reading the theory and getting engaged in it is not a program of where to go next, but the ability to ask the question, how might I live in a fresh way, right? In a way that isn't bound, right, to some of the stories that one has told oneself. But if you can open up that question of how might I live, right, in a new and fresh way, right, that would be a form of emancipation, right? Because you've lost the grip, right, of, we could say, the previous stories, which told you didn't raise the question, how might I live, but told you, here's how you must live, right? Right? You must live to be in this dot in here, or something like that, right? Yeah. So we just, the problem, I think, is we need, when we think of the terms, and this often happens both inside philosophy, but I see it a lot outside. There's a tendency to adopt the terms, and when you adopt the terms, you may not be getting at what the author means by those terms, and sometimes it takes some sorting out, right? So when Foucault rejects the notion of liberation, he's rejecting something very specific, right? He can't be rejecting the idea of political change. You know, why would he write the books, right, if he didn't want some change, right? And he didn't think that the possibility of that change might be something better. Right? So, you know, he certainly had that is a possibility. And if we think of emancipation as losing the grip of a certain thing, possibility of things getting better, right? Then in that sense his writings are emancipatory, but not in the other sense, right, of the thing there ready to be released.
That's not liberation?
The second, the thing there ready to be released?
To be free of?
To be free, to be free of the grip is a form of emancipation,
And
right?
liberation.
Yes, but, right, when Foucault says, I don't believe in liberation, and when Michael White quotes it, what he means is not the to be free of, but to allow something in particular to come out, right? It's a different meaning of the term liberation.
Could you say that he rejects a certain historical development of liberation?
That would be fair, yeah. A certain historically contingent way of seeing liberation. That would be that would be fair. Mark.
Well, and as therapists, we often find ourselves kind of in a struggle between being the liberators or the emancipators, or thinking of ourselves in that way with something specific in mind versus just creating the context in which a person might feel emancipated from something in their life, not because I'm emancipating them,
Right.
I'm creating conditions in which they might feel emancipated from ways of living that they don't like.
And I think that's right. And we actually were talking about this at lunch because Jana and Meg we were talking about this idea that there can be, for some people, a difficulty in being in a space where part of the point is that you don't know the answer, right? You're the therapist, but you don't have the answer, right? And the one person described it for me, Sarah Walter, said that what she had to lose the grip of thinking that there was some goal here, right? And she just talked and she didn't know where it was going to go, and that was really uncomfortable for a while. But then she got comfortable with the idea that I don't know where this is going to go or whether this is even going to work, right? But I'm not going to posit the thing that we need to get to, right?
So the metaphor that I use actually comes from psychoanalysis, but still it really works for me in a narrative sense. It's a ball of yarn, and when I'm working with someone, we're just following a string to see where that takes us.
Right. Except here's the thing: the yarn's got to be created as you're pulling, right? In other words, it isn't just there and you're unraveling it, right? The yarn's got to get created as you pull on it, right? Right. Some strange yarn. Good. Other than that, other questions, thoughts about Foucault? I want to particularly think in terms of stuff with Michael White or stuff that you've been or that you've heard about Foucault. Because the next thing we'll pass on to Deleuze after that. But I know that you've had some background in Foucault, so I want to make sure that we're intersecting in a way that's helpful, that the scaffoldings that I put in place is helpful, so that you have a frame just to think about it, and then as we would do periodically today, was bring it back downstream. Right.
A term that always seems to come up with Foucault is power, at least when I read about Foucault. And it seems like we've talked about the relations between permissibility and changing models of permissibility, but where is power in that dynamic?
In some sense, we've been talking about power all along. We just haven't labeled it that, right? Foucault's view is that we tend to think of power, there's a tendency theoretically, to think of power as stopping things from happening. Power prevents things, right? That's the traditional view. Right? So if the question is, what power does the state get? Well, what power does the state get is whatever power it takes to stop certain unacceptable things from happening. Right? Foucault said but power, and he was very historical about this, modern power, he said, often doesn't operate that way. Right? It doesn't operate by stopping things from happening. It operates by producing things. So what happens is that at the level of practices, remember we talked about that we get produced as products of these practices, right? That's power, right? Power is in the producing of things and in the producing of the ways in which we know about ourselves. So his famous concept is power knowledge, right? And I haven't used the concept, but this is what I've been describing, right? That the ways in which we know ourselves and think about ourselves are products of those practices, and those practices have produced us and produced ways of knowing about ourselves, and that they work together, right? So if we look back here, right, we have been produced to be normalized beings and been produced to know ourselves as normalized beings. And in knowing ourselves as normalized beings, that's a form of knowledge, but it's something that's been produced by the practices, that's the form of power, right? And he says, power often operates not by stopping things from happening. He says, in fact, that's probably, how we get created, that's probably more marginal, right? That the more interesting forms of power are the powers that create us to be certain things. And it isn't because somebody's sitting there thinking, how can I create this person to be this thing, right? But the practice itself doesn't, right? But the practice of engaging in psychology creates us to be certain things, right? So that's the form of power he talks about. Now, some people make this mistake with Foucault, thinking the object is then to get rid of power. But Foucault's first thought is, well, you can't do that, right? Because if power is in the practices and we're the product of the practices, you'd have to get rid of all our practices to get rid of power. He says the question is not how to get rid of power. The question is to ask ourselves, which forms of power are we okay with and which are we not? Or as he put it, the term he used was, which form of power are intolerable? That was his. So whenever he made normative judgments, it's always the same term, intolerable, right? So in thinking about how we're produced, right, we are thinking about power. We're thinking about the ways in which power has created us to be what we are. But there's no mystery about what power is here. It's just the ways, it's the operation of practices to make us this way as opposed to that way. But then the question then is not, how do we get rid of this? The question is, okay, now that we see how we have been produced, what do we think about it? Right? Is it okay? Is it intolerable? Right? Yeah, no, you're right, Colin. I was talking about it, but not bringing up the word. Right. Good. Other questions? Mary, okay?
I'm okay.
Because you did this sort of like this one of these, and I wasn't sure. Yeah.
No, I got it.
Okay. Good. Before we do, last chance. We're gonna hit the lose. We're ready? Okay. Let's go start with the lose.